not most, if not all, such punishments led to physical disfigurement and social ostracism. We might also argue from a legal moral point of view that those people who suffered mutilated punishments brought their fate upon themselves, but that's a completely different issue here. However, if we look at the categories, oops, that doesn't work. Now that works. If we look at the categories of disabilities proposed by Christian Leys in his book on disability and antiquity, namely physical handicaps, sensory impairment, speech disorders, learning disorders, or intellectual disabilities, mental conditions, or a combination of the above mentioned categories, it becomes clear that the question is not easily answered. Some, but not all, mutilations put a person under the categories 1 or 2. The removal of a limb certainly constitutes a physical handicap. That of a nose, eye, or ear may lead to sensory impairment. But what about tattooing or blackening and castration or emasculation? Does the change of appearance that results from branding the face or the extermination of a person's ability to procreate constitute a disability? Of course, the shock suffered from a mutilation can lead to serious mental disorders, and emasculation, if performed at an early age, leads to bodily changes, including speaking in a high-pitched voice. This paper focuses on elite discourses on mutilated individuals in historical and philosophical writings. I should say right away that I'm not looking at excavated texts, at least not for the purpose of today's presentation. I might include them in the final version of the paper. Such individuals were by no means rare in early China. Although we cannot be sure about the proportion of the population, the numbers of mutilated convicts who participated in large-scale construction projects at certain instances mentioned in the sources sometimes go into the tens of thousands. Thus, we can safely assume that convicts and those who were mutilated constituted an important part of the state's labor force. Now, just so that we are on the same page with regard to mutilating punishments. And before any one of you protests, I know that the image on the right-hand side is not very accurate. For instance, it lists the amputation of hand and feet under year. I just found the image too adorable not to show to you. So usually the list of mutilating punishments that are given in early Chinese sources go back to the punishment of Lu Xing chapter of the Canon of Documents. They are listed as, of course, execution as the severest form of corporal punishment, emasculation, gong fu, or other terms are used for this kind of mutilating punishment. Then the amputation of a foot or a kneecap, or maybe the removal of a leg below the kneecap, indicated by yue and fei. The amputation of a nose, and blackening, branding, or tattooing, whatever you prefer in that instance. Because someone who had undergone mutilations was marked for life, they could, of course, not return to their previous life and social status, and therefore were forced to enter government service, which often entailed hard physical labor, and henceforth they formed a social category on a par or maybe below other categories of state servants or slaves. Now, there are a variety of terms for those who were mutilated and henceforth entered government service. There seems to be even a neat equivalent for maimed servant in ancient Chinese, namely the hidden office, yin guan or yin gong. However, that term is indeed very rare, at least in traditional sources. It occurs one of the two, yin guan, occurs more often in excavated text, as Robin Yates knows very well. But apart from that, the term is quite rare, and its meaning is actually quite contested. So I'm not going to delve into yin guan and yin gong at this instance. let alone because some among present company have written much more expertly about the issue than I could summarize it here. So I'm going to focus on two terms, or rather three terms maybe, in particular. One is mutilated person, 行人, which sometimes includes those who were convicted to physical labor, even though that might basically be entailed from the fact that they had been mutilated and then later on forced to perform physical labor. Remnant of a mutilation, 刑余 or 刑余之人, and remnant of the knife and sword, 刀具之余. Other categories like Xumi or Duanzhi also appear in traditional sources, but I'm not going to talk about them here. I'm going to focus on 刑余之人 and 刑人 in particular. I should also point out that from their very beginning, these terms could refer to people who had just suffered any form of mutilating punishment. But the terms highlighted here, put in bold here, later on took on a meaning that was more narrowly restricted to eunuchs in imperial service. Now let's look at some examples for 刑余 from traditional sources. Late pre-imperial texts such as the Xunzi and the Hanfeizi use 刑余 in reference to mutilated persons or remnants of mutilating punishments in general, and not just to eunuchs. For instance, Xunzi in his treatise on ritual Li Lun states, as for burial rites for remnants of mutilations and criminals, one shall not assemble their clan members, but only their wives and children. The coffins are 3 inches thick and there are 3 layers of clothes. One shall not adorn the outer coffin nor proceed to the burial at midday, but inter them at night. One conducts the burial as if it were an everyday affair. There are no periods of wailing upon returning, nor hempen mourning clothes. No periods of mourning depending on the degree of relation. Everyone returns to normal and resumes their previous activities. Once the burial is finished, it is as if there had been no burial at all, and that is it. This is called the utmost of disgrace. Now, as we can see here, Xunzi, the philosopher, sees the remnant of mutilation as a person that is not only dead in the biological sense, but also in a moral, religious, and social sense. Cut off from their expanded clan or lineage and given only the most basic funerary rites, such a person could not even hope to receive sacrificial offerings. The absence of lineage members, apart from the wife and children at the burial, symbolizes the separation of such a person from the ancestral line. Although Xunzi famously saw the purpose of burial and mourning rites primarily in giving proper expression to people's feelings rather than a service to the dead, such a treatment marked the remnant of a mutilation as a social outcast even after their physical deaths. Now, while Xunzi does not specify of which kind of mutilating punishments the deceased was a remnant, Hanfeizi gives a rather poignant and tongue-in-cheek account of the hidden powers that a remnant of certain mutilations could yield at the court. There was a court gentleman in Qi by the name of Yi She, who was allowed to drink with the king. Greatly intoxicated, he went out and leaned against the gate and the galleries. The gatekeeper, a man who had had his foot amputated, Yue Gui, asked, "Does your honor have no intention of granting his servant the leftover drops?" Yi She replied, "Buzz off. What business does a person left over from a mutilation have to dare and back his superior for a drink?" The amputee rushed away. When Yi She had left, the amputee thereupon splashed water below the eaves of the gate so that it looked as if someone had urinated there. The next day, the king went out and condemned it, asking, "Who urinated here?" The amputee replied, "I did not witness it. However, yesterday, the court gentleman Yi She stood here. The king thus blamed Yi She and had him killed." Now, wrapped in this anecdote are several layers of meaning. On the one hand, there is a strong moralizing sense of Xingyu that ascribes all kinds of vile and vindictive behavior to someone who had been mutilated. On the other, it illustrates the power and hence menacing influence such a person could wield while serving even in a low position at court. The most famous occurrence of 刑于之人, literally remnant from a mutilating punishment, is found in Sima Qian's letter to Ren An, in which Sima Qian laments his fate after having been emasculated for his defense of the General Li Ling after the latter's abortive campaign against the Xiongnu. A man left a remnant from a mutilating punishment counts for nothing in others' estimation. Not only in one era has this been so, this has always been the case. From antiquity then, to consort with eunuchs has been a source of shame. Even a man of mediocre talent will always risk real damage to his qi when he comes into contact with a eunuch in the course of his business. How much more so a gentleman with soaring aspirations? The court may currently lack the right sort of man, but why do you think it would allow a remnant of the knife and saw? That's the occurrence of the Daoju Zhiyu I talked about earlier to recommend men of distinctions in the empire. Now, for Sima Qian, Xingyu could refer exclusively to eunuchs, and while the historian claims that consorting with eunuchs had been a source of shame since antiquity, the semantic restriction of Xingyu to eunuchs in Sima's own days had actually been a recent phenomenon, probably due to the abolition of mutilating punishments around about 50 years earlier. What we can see from such examples is, however, that Xingyu carried a strong pejorative meaning from an earlier period. This, of course, is also due to the bias of our sources, since we lack ego documents written by eunuchs up until late imperial times. Most of what we know about maimed servants comes from excavated legal text or such historical and philosophical accounts. And there are other instances in which 刑于之人 or 刑人 are mentioned in remonstrations throughout the Han period by officials, such as this one by the Ge Kuan Rao. Nowadays, the ways of the sages are more and more abandoned. The methods of the classicists are not put into effect. Remnants of mutilating punishments are taken for dukes of Zhou and Shao, and legal codes are taken for oaths and documents. Now, let's turn to Xingren. And already the term Xingren actually occurs in canonical scripture. And there we find exhortations that the ruler or gentleman should steer clear of mutilated offenders. The term used most often in this context is 不尽新人. We have one line in the Li Ji, in the famous passage where it says that ritual does not reach down to the common people, punishments do not reach up to the dignitaries, and then it goes on, mutilated persons are not at the side or have no place at the side of the ruler. And then we find a passage under year 29 of Duke Xiang in the Gongyang Zhuan. The gentleman does not approach a mutilated person. To approach a mutilated person is the way of taking death lightly. Those who wish to advise their rulers against keeping close company with eunuchs later picked up these classical exhortations, for instance, in a reproof by Xiao Wangzhi against the trusted emperor Yuan of the Han, placed in his eunuchs Shixian and Honggong. Emperor Wu held banquets in the rear court. This is basically looking backwards to the reign of Emperor Wu. Therefore, he used eunuchs, which are not an ancient institution. Your Majesty should do away with the eunuch secretary and, in compliance with antiquity, should not be on intimate terms with a mutilated person. Now, again, here we see this narrowing of Xingren to eunuchs, which is, as I mentioned earlier, probably due to the presumed abolition or abatement of mutilating punishments under Han Emperor Wen in around 167 BC. Now let's look at one final very interesting example to show you that this term was by no means limited to male individuals, but we also find the term xingyu applied to females. And I'm greatly grateful to Avital for pointing out this passage to me, which is from Lianu Zhuan. And it reads, I have heard that the duty of a wife is that once she has gone out to marry, she will not change to keep intact her chastity and faithfulness. And it's quite interesting that what she refers to here, Tren, is the very same term that Roel mentioned yesterday in his talk, that it's about remaining intact, remaining complete. Now, and this story has a very interesting twist because she was approached by the ruler of Wei to marry him after her first husband has died. And now she refuses to do that. And she argues now to forget the dead, her late husband, and to hurry after the living, the king is unfaithful. To see honor and forget the humble, this is unchaste. One who abandons duty and follows profit has nothing that makes them human. She took a mirror and a knife and cut off her nose, saying, I have now become a mutilated person. The reason I did not choose death is because I could not bear to see my children orphaned once more. There's space missing. The king chased me for my attractiveness. Now that I have become a mutilated remnant, Xingyu, he can probably let go of me. Now she protects her Tren, her moral Tren, by mutilating her own body. And this is actually, I think, a rather interesting twist. Now, I'm almost at the end of my time. This leaves the question open, can we talk about mutilated individuals as disabled individuals? I'm not entirely sure what the answer to that question should be. At the very least, I think that the category and the ubiquity of mutilated individuals in ancient China, at least before the abolition of mutilating punishments by Emperor Wen, at least calls for a re-evaluation of what we actually understand by disabled individuals. And with that, I finish. Thank you very much.